איפה את רשות הדיבור לפרופסור גולן, בבקשה.
תודה רבה, זה פועל, אז אני אוכל לשבת. התכוונתי לעבור לאנגלית. אני בעצם הכנתי הרצאה באנגלית, כי חשבתי שיהיו לי שותפים שאולי לא דוברי עברית, אז ברשותכם אני אעבור לאנגלית. אני לא הייתי צריכה לעבור מחסומים כדי להגיע הנה, אבל אני כן לימדתי עד עכשיו, ולכן אני מתנצלת שלא הייתי בהרצאות הקודמות. I think that I may be similar to, or I hope I won't be similar to third parties, or what's often said about third parties. That is that they come in late, they don't have a clue about what went ahead of them or before them, and they suggest all kinds of things that are totally irrelevant to everything that's been said. I'm hoping that won't be the case now. Well, we've had third-party involvement, obviously, in our conflict in one form or another since the beginning of the conflict, and certainly since the founding of the state, whether it was the mandate authority or conference conveners or mediators or peacekeepers or special envoys or fact-finders or NGOs, you name it. And still, of course, there's no end to the conflict. Although that doesn't mean, in my opinion, that they were all unsuccessful. And I think a lot depends upon what each objective was, in fact. And I think it would be too simplistic to simply write it all off and say that they were all failures. By the same token, we could probably say that if the two sides, the Israelis and the Palestinians, were ready and willing, we could reach an agreement tomorrow without any outside involvement. I think that may also be a bit too simplistic. There are many forms of third-party involvement and many stages at which this kind of involvement could take place. First of all, I think we should make a distinction between involvement and intervention, between מעורבות והתערבות. It's extremely important, I think, to see that difference right away, because there are those who may yearn for intervention. Intervention is by definition without agreement of the parties involved. You might have intervention of an outside party, the third party, into a failed state to bring about order. You may have intervention to bring about, to restore authority, or to bring about, impose peace on warring sides, such as interventions that have taken place, of course, in Kosovo and Somalia. And we've often heard, certainly in the past, the wish that somebody would come and impose peace on us, make us do what is in our own best interest, perhaps. That would be called probably peace enforcement. Didn't mean it, I really didn't. That might be called peace enforcement, where we could imagine a situation where the United Nations Security Council would decide to send a force to separate the sides here, maybe push Israeli forces out of the territories, similar perhaps to a situation in Bosnia. But I think that's most unlikely as an option. I think it's even preposterous, namely because the Security Council would not, and really can't, act without American agreement. The United States would never agree because Israel wouldn't permit it. And I don't think there'd be any other country that would be willing to take on such a task, within or without the framework of the United Nations. So I don't think there's really much need to discuss this form of peace enforcement, namely a third-party intervention forcing or imposing peace. But there are other forms of peace enforcement which would belong to the category of involvement, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So if we take involvement as distinct from intervention, involvement's based on agreement that the parties concerned, and I think that's what's relevant to our discussion. First of all, we have to look at the objectives of the involvement. The objectives are critical. There is a whole list in terms of the jargon in the literature. There's peacemaking, there's peacekeeping, there's peace building, and there's peace enforcing. And these objectives can be roughly divided into two categories. A category that talks about or is looking for changing the situation, resolving the conflict, maybe even going beyond the conflict to post-conflict behavior, post-withdrawal behavior. And other parts of these objectives, or others, are more in the category of dealing with the situation as it is, what could be called crisis management, but something in the direction of not trying or striving for a change or resolution, but simply dealing with the situation. And clearly the role of the third party will depend upon the objective or the mandate out of this list of objectives. So if we had, in terms of the role of the party, if we look at it by objective, peacemaking would seek to resolve the conflict through various methods, whether methods that we've seen in the past, convening conferences, providing blueprints or plans, diplomatic pressure perhaps, all of these with the purpose of bringing about an agreement, bringing about a settlement. Peacekeeping usually is connected with an agreement of some kind, an interim agreement, an indirect, it can be a verbal, it can be written, but peacekeeping is generally connected with some form of agreement. And the roles that we would see in peacekeeping can be monitoring, providing reports on what is going on, verification, where you actually check if each side is keeping what it's supposed to do or doing what it's supposed to do. Compliance might be a part of the role, that is a proactive role to ensure that each side is doing what it's supposed to do. These would be, within the objective of peacekeeping, the types of roles that we would expect from a third party. And then there's peace building. Peace building would include things like training and preparing or guiding groups for a peaceful coexistence, if you will. In other words, the building or assistance in the building of institutions, of infrastructure, be they economic or political or administrative. This is the type of thing we see today in Kosovo. Might even be, if we're talking about peace building, we might even have as a role for a third party to manage or to administer an area, such as we have or had in East Timor, even to the point of creating a trusteeship out of the entity that we're dealing with. This role of peace building may also include building trust, may include peace education, trying to bring about reconciliation between former adversaries. All of that would be under the category, I think, of peace building. And then peace enforcement would be actually assisting the new authority in gaining control or maintaining control and order in the area. It could be a question of active assistance in helping them keep order between warring groups or hostile groups within the entity, and this is the kind of role that third parties have played in Haiti, in Somalia, in Liberia. Or it could be restoring order once an agreement has broken down, even could include the actual use of force in the case that an agreement has broken down, in order to restore order. This, of course, borders on intervention and is very problematic, but it's the idea of using force to restore peace. Obviously, there are a lot of questions and factors that enter into all of these roles and are involved in each of these roles once the objectives or the mandate is decided. And as I repeat, the key, I believe, is the objective or the mandate for the third party. But of course, there are all these other questions. Who is the third party? How is the third party chosen? Is it a government, international organization, NGO? What is the source of the authority, the sponsoring organization? And today, of course, it's primarily the United Nations, certainly in the interventions that we've seen in the past 10, 15 years. The legitimacy of the United Nations is what's sought. It's not always obtained, as we know, but that seems to be the body that's most sought after as a legitimizing force. Of course, there are questions about the actual composition of a third party, also a question of how familiar a third party will be with the situation, with the languages involved, questions of modus operandi of this third party, the chain of command, will it have access or its own institutions or own frameworks for intelligence gathering, intelligence cooperation, financing of these groups. or the third party is important. The rules of engagement, obviously, are critical. And the duration, extremely important to know when and how and who will decide when the third party's role is completed. And of course, there are many more factors involved and things that have to be taken into consideration and determined. The question is, how would all of this apply today? And I think that today there are basically two options, more or less, on the table. More options exist, but I think there are probably two that we are trying to deal with. One is a negotiated settlement in the form, today at least, in the form of the roadmap, and the other is unilateral withdrawal, beginning with, or certainly in the form of disengagement. So where does the third party fit into these two options? With regard to the roadmap obviously comes from a third party to begin with, from the quartet. But nonetheless, I think a major flaw in the roadmap, or major shortcoming, was in fact the absence of a clearly defined role for a third party. In the roadmap, a third party is to convene a conference for a final status agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. And the third party also has the role of monitoring. Now, that's certainly progress when compared with Oslo, because one of the problems and flaws of Oslo was that there was not a serious monitoring, if any, really, monitoring written into the agreements, and I think was missing. But even in the roadmap, while they did indeed see this flaw from Oslo, and I assume tried to correct it, nonetheless, the monitoring that they talk about in the roadmap is far from clear and far from sufficient. It is to begin, if it ever happens, it is to begin at a relatively late stage, not during the first stage. During the first stage, it's supposed to only use whatever one has in the air, right on the ground. But a formal monitoring group will only come in the second stage, or relatively late. But much more important than that, the authority of the monitoring group is not clearly delineated. It's not clear what powers it will have, if it will be peacekeeping, or if it will have the task simply of reporting or verifying or perhaps compliance. It's not at all clear if it will have any of those roles, or even, of course, even to the point of peace enforcement. So it's not at all clear in the roadmap what the role will be, nor for that matter what its objective will be, because the objective is what will determine the role. Tenet made some proposals, not necessarily officially and formally, and there were many ideas and suggestions raised around the roadmap regarding the role of the third party. There was a suggestion by Tenet and others that there be committees set up, or groups, commissions, whatever we want to call them, one for economic matters, one for security issues and possibly intelligence, one for humanitarian issues, and one for what were called special issues, which was perhaps meant to be political issues, preparing for political resolution of the conflict. I think if the roadmap does come on the agenda again, and it's possible that it will, it would be important to examine these suggestions with regard to various committees. But certainly, in any case, if the roadmap does come on the agenda again, it's extremely important that the role of the monitor, the role of the third party, and again, whether it's just a monitor or more than that, be examined, be delineated very clearly so that it could act and have a mandate with maximum efficiency and efficacy. And of course, one would have to take a good look at the composition. When these ideas first came up with the roadmap, Israel made it very clear that it would only accept the United States as a head of any kind of monitoring team or third party, and also that decisions within the third party be unanimous. I'll get back to the role of the United States later in my remarks. By the way, the Geneva Initiative actually went well beyond all of this with regard to a third party. The Geneva proposals came up with a very complex hierarchy of institutions and international commissions and committees and authorities, not only to monitor, but in some cases to actually implement, that is, undertake compliance. I won't go into it. I think also some of the tasks of the third party, as envisaged by Geneva, were supposed to come in the appendices, which have not yet been produced as far as I know. And then there is the other option, the option of unilateral moves, and specifically disengagement. And here I think there is quite a role, potential role in any case, for a third party. The Toledo Center for Peace, I had never heard of them, I must admit, but they brought together a very small group of Israelis and Palestinians and produced an extraordinary document, which is called A Proposal for Governance of the Gaza Strip in the Context of the Announced Israeli Withdrawal. We did this in November 2004. This is an extraordinarily detailed plan for the governance of Gaza within the context of disengagement, as I said, which goes into great detail with regard to the role of a third party. They call the third party the international community authorized by the United Nations. And they outline the role of a third party in great detail in all areas, in economic, security, administration, and so forth. It's detailed even into what they call an international security enforcing mission would do directly or indirectly. Basically, what we have here is a proactive proposal, which includes even peace enforcement. In other words, direct assistance to Palestinian security forces in keeping order. Direct assistance to the Palestinian security forces in keeping order temporarily, obviously not on a permanent basis, and obviously only with agreement by the Palestinians, but certainly a role that goes well beyond training and monitoring, even verification. In broad terms, this proposal and some of the others would include the following roles or tasks for a third party: inspection or verification at the airport and the seaports and international border crossings, including Philadelphia. This would be monitoring, this would be inspection and verification regarding goods, and possibly monitoring the entry of persons as well into the Gaza Strip. Secondly, inspection, verification, possibly compliance within Gaza itself regarding illegal weapons production. Third, supervision of movement between Gaza and the West Bank. In other words, if there is a connecting link, it would be supervised by this third party. Monitoring of the infrastructure, that is water and electricity supplies, so long as there's a connection with Israel. 5, dispute or crisis resolution. This would be assistance in case of intrusions or excursions from Gaza. In other words, if there is a terrorist attack and the culprits flee back into Gaza, assistance in turning them back over to Israel, assistance in conflicts that would arise, of course, in the course of the disengagement and so forth. 6, training of security forces, police, the border police, and so forth. 7, economic and administrative assistance in building the institutions and infrastructure, including assistance in building an independent judiciary, the health services, education, and so forth. And finally, 8, disposition of the economic assets, that is the facilities that will be left behind by Israel, the economic areas, and of course the assets themselves. Obviously, the authority and the limits and the exact functions of this third party, this international community, as it's called, must be clearly delineated. That's obvious, I think, from everything that's been said so far. And obviously, it would also have to have, there would have to be regular reports to the United Nations, time limits, longer or shorter, but certainly provisions for renewal of this force, reconfirmation, and so forth. These things would obviously have to be very clearly delineated. The composition Well, we know already pretty much the composition, at least what's been done so far, which we already heard, of course, from Renan. The Egyptians are already involved, the British are already involved, the World Bank is already involved, and in fact the World Bank is being used to a great deal by Israel as almost a mediator in this whole situation. We know that even though this is a unilateral move or unilateral initiative and is intended to be unilateral, nonetheless Israel has not only turned to outside groups to be involved, but they've also been coordinating directly or indirectly with the Palestinians. But Israeli preference with regard to a third party is clearly for the United States. I would even go so far as to say an exclusive preference for the United States, beyond the very limited role that it envisages for the Britain, and the relatively not so limited and important role that is envisaged for Egypt. But certainly if there is to be any kind of force, third-party group or force, it would have to be, according to Israel, I think, led by the United States. Most proposals certainly envisage an important role or a primary role for the United States. The United States itself has said that it is unwilling to undertake anything like a third-party role in the disengagement alone. It hasn't said it's unwilling to participate at all, but it is unwilling, and they've repeated that, to act alone. And certainly given their commitments today in Afghanistan and of course in Iraq, it would be, I think, foolhardy to expect them to take a particularly important role. Though we might have something, there are signs, of course, that they would agree if they were one of many and could limit their role. The EU is obviously interested. We've certainly heard that enough. Not exactly Israel's first choice, of course, but the EU states are definitely interested and experienced. They're experienced and could indeed bring a good deal to the role of a third party. There's been talk of NATO, and there's been talk inside NATO of not of sending a NATO force, which was done in Kosovo, and not sending NATO troops even for peacekeeping, but although it's been suggested. But basically the idea would be for them to use their Mediterranean dialogue, that is their contacts with the Arab states in the area, with various Middle Eastern countries, that they use these contacts of the Mediterranean dialogue in order to assist in the planning of the withdrawal and the period after the withdrawal. For example, they've proposed, and they may already be doing it without my knowing anything about it, they've proposed assisting Egypt in formulating its peacekeeping functions on the border and so forth. Finally, Israel's position regarding third-party involvement. I think Israel's position has undergone changes over the past half year, maybe more. There are, of course, these talks with the World Bank and the working with the World Bank and others regarding the assets and properties that are going to be presumably or possibly turned over to a third party rather than to the Palestinians upon evacuation of Gaza. Also, if we look at the disengagement plan itself, Sharon has said, and the plan envisages the possibility of, in quotes, eventually giving up Israeli control of airports, seaports, and eventually even turning Philadelphia over to a third party. Though at the moment, at the present, if we look at what's been said or written, at present these are very vague and conditional references to turning these over to a third party. The way it's written in the disengagement plan is, if and when security reality permits, Israel will consider turning these areas over to a third party. Interestingly, public opinion, I think, is changing somewhat. Haaretz had an editorial a few months ago calling for turning these areas over to a third party. And the Steinmetz Center study recently showed changes in public opinion, comparing opinion in 2002, where only 30% of Jewish adults favored third-party intervention and resolution of the conflict. More recently, I believe it was November, 46% were in favor. In other words, the percentages were going up. It's still not a majority, but it does indicate, I think, something of a change. Of course, the third party that's preferred is the United States. We should have no illusions. It's overwhelmingly the United States. Britain is second by preference, but very far behind. And 61% oppose the EU as the third party. Finally, I want to say just a word about why I believe a third party is necessary for disengagement in a very broad form and now, that is, from the beginning and not just eventually. I have two working assumptions, at least for the purposes of discussion. There could be other working assumptions, but I would put two out there. One is Israel's interest is security. And second, the Palestinian interest is an end to the occupation. If I posit these two assumptions, I would also add that an overriding interest should be, in my opinion, that disengagement be seen as a beginning of Israeli withdrawal according to Resolution 242 and resolution of the conflict. In other words, a first step and not a last step. And this can only happen, all of these things can be achieved only, in my opinion, and disengagement can only be a step in a further direction, only if it does in fact end the occupation of Gaza, and if it works. In other words, if it provides or at least does not harm Israel's security. And I think to achieve these two goals, and they're related, of course, they're intertwined, of Israel's security and an end to the occupation, and then my own third goal of moving forward. For these things, all three, I think a third party is needed. Israeli security may, and I underline the word may, be significantly improved on that front at least, if the Palestinians perceive the withdrawal as the end of occupation of Gaza. I said may, it's not certain, but I'll explain what I mean. As we know, as the disengagement plan stands today, Israel maintains control over the envelope, what's called the envelope. All access to and from the Gaza Strip by air, by sea, by land, with the right to re-intervene for security purposes. Now, Israel may be giving up its governance of Gaza and on this and its claim to any responsibility for what goes on inside Gaza, but that does not change the fact that this will not be the end of occupation of the Gaza Strip. And the Justice Ministry recently put out a clarification of just this point. And obviously, as long as Israel is in the Philadelphia area, it's hard to argue that occupation will be ended. Israel will be maintaining this control for security purposes, to prevent smuggling of arms, to prevent incursions and terrorism. But it's this very maintenance of control that may well provoke or at least create a disincentive for the Palestinians to refrain from terror attempts and violence, or at the very least, this maintenance of control will weaken the Palestine Authority's legitimacy and therefore its efforts to prevent terrorism or violence coming from Gaza. And apart from this incentive and legitimacy, there is the very real problem of the Palestine Authority's ability, its ability to maintain security, with all that of course entails. And that's where I believe the third party comes in serving the interests, I think, of both sides, by assuming the functions that I've mentioned from the various proposals in the area of peace building, but also the role of monitoring and compliance with regard to the sea and airports, international land access, including Philadelphia. The third party can relieve Israel of these critical tasks and thereby transform the disengagement into an actual end of the occupation of Gaza. This would provide, or could provide, both legitimacy and incentive for the Palestinians to maintain security. And it's in further functions, it could link this insurance of stability within Gaza or if we have a third party which could, as I say, link this keeping of order or this ensuring of stability via institution building, including institutions connected with security and legal institutions, via institution building, training, financing, and actual assistance for internal peace enforcement. In other words, the third party could provide the Palestinians with the ability, in addition to the incentive and legitimacy for maintaining security. I'm not saying this will be enough. I'm not certain this would be enough to move us forward to an overall withdrawal and a peace agreement. Obviously, much more is needed. We need a ceasefire, a total ceasefire, freeze of building in the settlements, negotiations. And I think for these two, a third party, specifically the United States, will be necessary. But I think that without most, if not all, of the measures that I've outlined for a third party regarding disengagement, it will be hard to conceive that there'll be a real chance for progress after the disengagement. Thank you.